If you heard that 13% of America's credit card debt is seriously delinquent, you might picture a sudden wave of people missing payments and a consumer crisis approaching Great Recession levels. That is not what the number means. The figure is real, but it mixes recent missed payments with old defaults that can remain visible on credit reports long after banks have written them off. A better measure of new trouble is closer to 7%, and it has been broadly stable for almost 2 years. So this is not a story about a fake statistic. It is a story about choosing the right statistic for the question you are asking. And underneath the measurement problem, there is still a genuine warning about borrowers who are already financially stretched. Let's start with the two numbers getting the most attention. In the second quarter of 2026, credit card balances reported to the New York Fed rose by $21 billion to about $1.263 trillion. Roughly 13% of reported credit card balances were classified as at least 90 days delinquent or severely derogatory. That sounds as if 13% of cardholders suddenly stopped paying. But it does not measure people, and it does not measure new delinquencies. It measures the share of balances sitting in a delinquent category at one point in time. One borrower with a $10,000 delinquent balance affects it 10 times as much as a borrower with a $1,000 balance. And some of the debt counted in that total may have entered default years earlier. Even the $1.263 trillion balance needs context. Credit card balances are not automatically the same thing as revolving interest-bearing debt. Imagine you put $1,000 of normal spending on a card during August. Your statement closes with a $1,000 balance, so that amount may appear in a credit report snapshot. If you pay the bill in full by the due date, you do not carry that $1,000 from one billing cycle into the next, and generally do not pay interest on those purchases. You are using the card as a payment tool, not as a long-term loan. Someone else might make the same $1,000 of purchases, pay only $100, and carry $900 forward. That person is revolving debt and may owe interest. Both accounts can contribute to an aggregate balance figure, but their financial situations are completely different. This is why saying Americans owe more than $1 trillion on cards is not the same as saying every dollar is being carried month to month at a high interest rate. The total still matters. It tells us how much card debt is visible at the reporting date. It just cannot tell us, by itself, how much is new spending, how much will soon be paid in full, or how much is generating interest. If you enjoy explanations that separate the useful signal from the scary headline, consider subscribing. That is what we do here, without pretending that every large number is either a crisis or nothing to worry about. Now we can unpack the 13% figure. There are three different concepts being mixed together in the public conversation. The first is the stock delinquency rate. The second is the flow into delinquency. The third is the delinquency and charge-off data reported by banks. Think of the stock rate as the amount of water currently sitting in a bathtub. It includes water that entered this morning and water that has been there for a while. The flow rate is the water entering through the faucet. It asks how much previously performing debt has newly moved into serious delinquency. The New York Fed's stock measure says roughly 13% of outstanding reported credit card balances are in the 90 days late or worse category. Its flow measure says about 7% of balances that had not been seriously delinquent transitioned into that status over the annualized measurement period. In the second quarter of 2026, that flow was about 6.97%. 1 year earlier, it was about 6.93%. In other words, the pace of balances newly entering serious delinquency barely changed year over year. It remains elevated, but the latest reading does not show a sudden acceleration to 13%. Here is a simplified example. Suppose a lender begins with $100 million of performing card balances. During the year, $7 million becomes seriously delinquent. That is roughly a 7% flow into serious delinquency. Now suppose $8 million of older defaulted debt is still being reported from previous years. The system could show $15 million of delinquent balances even though only $7 million became newly delinquent this year. Next year, another $7 million defaults. The flow has not worsened. But if only $2 million of the older delinquent balances disappears from the data, the stock grows from $15 million to $20 million. The bathtub is filling, even though the faucet has not been opened any further. The drain has simply slowed down. That is close to what has complicated the New York Fed series. When a credit card payment becomes severely overdue, the lender eventually charges off the account, typically after roughly 4 to 6 months. A charge-off is an accounting action. The bank removes the loan from the performing assets on its balance sheet and recognizes that it probably will not collect the full amount. But a charge-off does not automatically erase what the borrower owes. The lender may continue collection efforts, transfer the account, or keep updating the credit bureaus. That creates an important difference between data sources. Bank regulatory reports generally remove charged-off balances from both the delinquent balance and the total loan balance. Once the charge-off occurs, that debt leaves the bank's delinquency ratio. The New York Fed's Consumer Credit Panel looks at credit reports from the borrower's side. If a charged-off balance is still being reported as an obligation, it remains visible and can be classified as severely derogatory. Neither approach is inherently wrong. They answer different questions. The bank data are useful for asking how much of the debt currently on lenders' books is late. The credit report stock is useful for asking how much unresolved bad debt is still following borrowers through the financial system. The historical comparison becomes tricky because reporting behavior has changed. New York Fed researchers found that between 2004 and 2012, only about 40% of charged-off debts were still being reported 1 year later. By 2024, that share had doubled to 80%. So recent defaults remain in the dataset longer than older defaults did. That allows severely derogatory balances to pile up, pushing the stock delinquency rate higher even after the rate of new serious delinquencies has stabilized. When researchers removed those charged-off balances, the adjusted stock measure lined up much more closely with the flow measure and with bank-reported delinquency data. All three showed a similar pattern. Conditions deteriorated after the unusually low delinquency period of the pandemic, then largely leveled off around 2024. This also explains why direct comparisons with the Great Recession can be misleading. If defaulted accounts disappear faster in one era and remain visible longer in another, comparing the two stock rates is not a clean apples-to-apples test of current repayment stress. But we should not overcorrect and declare that everything is fine. A stable flow can still be stable at an uncomfortable level. Roughly 7% of eligible credit card balances transitioning into serious delinquency is not trivial. And more than 23 million Americans still have charged-off credit card balances appearing on their credit reports. Those old defaults may not describe this quarter's economy, but they can still affect the people attached to them. The stress is also concentrated rather than evenly distributed. Federal Reserve analysis has found that much of the post-2022 increase in credit card delinquency came from borrowers with non-prime credit scores. Earlier New York Fed research also found that high utilization was strongly associated with future missed payments. In that study, borrowers who remained current had used a median of 13% of their available credit in the previous quarter. Borrowers who became newly delinquent had used a median of 90%. Among borrowers using at least 90% of their total card limits, about 1/3 of balances became delinquent over the following year. Younger card users and people living in lower income areas were also more likely to be near their limits, partly because they generally had smaller credit lines. That is the real warning beneath the headline. The average household balance sheet does not look like the Great Recession. Overall household debt relative to the size of the economy remains far below the levels seen around that crisis, and mortgage performance is much stronger. But averages can hide fragile groups. A borrower paying every statement in full and a borrower using a credit card to cover groceries until payday both appear inside the same national balance total. Only one may be a job loss, medical bill, or car repair away from missing the minimum payment. So when you see the 13% number, remember three questions. Is it measuring people, accounts, or dollars? Is it measuring new delinquencies or all delinquent balances still visible? And does it include debt that banks have already charged off? For the latest data, the most accurate summary is this. Credit card balances are high. New serious delinquencies are elevated, but broadly stable. The dramatic rise toward 13% is partly a reporting duration effect, not evidence that repayment behavior suddenly collapsed. Yet borrowers with low credit quality, small limits, and nearly maxed out cards remain under genuine pressure. That answer is less dramatic than the headline, but far more useful. If there is another confusing debt statistic you want unpacked, leave it in the comments and suggest what we should explain next.